where will you find resilience? REdeploy. I'm going to start off actually with a question for in Casey's realm, but I would love to hear the panel's thoughts on this. How do you think, or how can resilience engineering most be helpful to chaos engineering, the practice, the community, that group? Since we talked about they're different and there's overlap, how can we as resilience engineers help out that community? No. I said for you, but also the rest of the panel. I mean,
so the best way that the resilience engineering community could help chaos engineering is if one particular local participant, community organizer, resilience engineering community, Nora Jones, helps me finish writing the book.
I think is Nora here? Okay, I think when I know I've been asking you to do a lot of applause, but why don't we give Nora a round of applause as encouragement? Can I talk about the website? Is it launched yet? It's not launched. Can I talk about it? I mean, it's like, no, you can't talk about it. I'm sorry. No. Nora is working on a learning from incidents in software website that's going to have actually some of the things that we talked about in terms of making it more accessible, so it's not 8,000 PDFs, of which, 7,000 of them are from Mr. Allspaw. So we're working on that problem. In fact, Nora is spearheading that, so she's kind of busy at the moment. But yes, it would be great to have that. Casey, did you have more?
Yeah, so a more serious answer, like more data would be nice. Not more PDFs necessarily, but more data. In particular, a problem that's been bugging me is redundancy doesn't seem to correlate with better availability properties, and I'd love for somebody to figure out what the relationship between the two actually is.
Cool. Any other thoughts on the panel about chaos engineering and resilience engineering?
So I haven't done much in the chaos engineering space, but one of the things that really struck me as we were talking and we were going through the other pieces is that things go to turn in one another at different levels. We saw this with like autonomy types of things that I was talking about. And so one of the things that I think resilience engineering as a community may be able to contribute is find some of the framing to bring meaning and kind of a framing for how we learn from the chaos experiments and what we're trying to achieve with them, to use that higher level cognitive framing.
You mentioned the redundancy part, and I think that's an interesting area to look at because I mentioned during my talk that redundancy alone does not give resilience. And we've seen a lot of famous cases like the Ariane 5s, like Rocket, other types of cases where redundant systems have failed because one component has failed in the same way as another. So it has not been resilient to the kind of changes or adapted to those conditions. But I want to point out that that's redundancy in terms of components, but it's not redundancy in terms of functions. We can still have redundant systems, but looking at it from a different perspective of trying to maybe have redundant coverage of different things, of looking at redundant perspectives on a particular phenomenon that you're trying to see. That to me feels like a better avenue for resilience because you're trying to come at it in a different way, in a functional sense, rather than just systems of subsystems.
Yeah, so that's an interesting point. So I would add the two examples I like to bring up are the Challenger explosion as an example where redundancy perhaps was a contributing factor to the disaster. This is known as an example of the motors in Black Hawk helicopters are redundant, and because of that, the pilots run them faster and further than spec because they know the redundancy is there. That's burning out both motors. So if it wasn't redundant, presumably they wouldn't do that. NASA for one of their flight control systems, they hired, that they considered super critical, they hired 2 different engineering companies to satisfy the spec for the control systems simultaneously. So they had these separate engineering teams both build a system that satisfied the specifications, and then ran I forget if it was a shuttle or something else under the control of one of the programs, and had the other program as a backup in case the first one failed. It had some sort of automatic failover. The presumption being that that different functional route provided a different form of Swiss cheese that would block other kinds of lane errors from getting through, and so that the assumption was that that gave them more safety. But it seems like the human knowledge of redundancy in the system is part of what contributes to redundancy backfiring. And so I don't know, there's some element of complexity there that I don't think we've quite teased out.
I was going to ask for a clarification, but before I do that, or instead of doing that, any audience questions? Yes.
So one thing that I noticed from Jabe's talk was towards the end he talked about sort of attractors for the resilience engineering community. I'm wondering, what attractors do you think there might be for resilience engineering beyond postmortems, beyond the incident lifecycle?
I think there's a couple interesting crossover conversations or attractors that I would be thinking about if I were doing cognitive, if I were to reframe some of what I was talking about this cognitive. One of the most simple ones is just how does resilience engineering and serverless work together? If you consider serverless to be an attempt to shrink systems down small enough to get someone's head, it's a very active form of cognitive engineering at that point. So there's one like conversation that should happen, and one invitation to have. When I think of attractors, I try to think of, you have kind of like a bowl. That's the circle that's the attractor, and you want to find the marbles that are nearby and kind of nudge it in, if that makes any sense. So that's one of the first ones I might suggest. Obviously, there seems to be chaos engineering is something that's close and nearby. I think there's probably some interesting conversations to be had with kind of David Snowden's group and his way of thinking. There's a lot of people out there who want to talk about Kevin. It is a well-explored space. It's not new, but it would be an interesting adjacency for you guys to talk about that with people, I think. What else can I think of? I don't know. What else do you guys have?
One of the places that I've been playing with it relatively actively is when we think about user experience and how we model these things so that the tooling that we provide operationally actually works with our human cognitive systems to enable us to do things better. This goes to a lot of what Marisa was talking about in her talk. So we talk a lot about UX, we talk a lot about design, we talk a lot about these types of things, and then we design web UIs for operational tools that simply hide all of the relevant information that would allow us to actually mediate and resolve incidents. So it goes way beyond just the incident management post-mortem into the full engineering cycle, from understanding your problems, which is an anthropological question, is not a requirements engineering form specification question, all the way through, have you actually done something that resolves those problems? And the tools that we use in resilience engineering, when we talk about post-mortem and post-incident analysis, to my mind are essentially the same tools that we need to solve other classes of problems where we're failing to solve them today because of the way that we fragment the work.
Yeah, I mean, perfect examples of information architecture rhymes with your thing quite well. There's a nice rhyming there. And then the way that information architecture makes things accessible under pressure, is already kind of cognitively tractable, all those types of things are interesting things to explore in relationship to observability, and some of these issues that we have to deal with, I think. So I think there's some really interesting things to play with there as well, definitely.
Speaking of UI UX, trying to think about, especially for, like, say, incident commanders or anyone who's actually taking charge of a situation where there's an incident ongoing, you do have different requirements of a decision support tool as an actual class of interface. You know, the information that you're trying to surface, you're trying to track ideas, all these different aspects of how to do decision making do require different things from the design than our basic tooling would have right now. I mean, there's some great tools out there. I mean, tons of companies are trying to promote their observability suites, their tracking networks, but that is leaving a lot of the burden on the responders to actually integrate that information and to even have an awareness of where the information is coming from. And you have to have a model of what all these processes are doing, what all these components are talking to, working with, in order to even read some of the software that is supposed to trying to make this understandable and serviceable, which there's still plenty of room for improvement on that.
So, that reminds me, another Rein that I can think of is Kobar's hexagonal architectures, which is kind of like a way of thinking of multi-perspectives in the same architecture. User need, as in like the consumer need, has overdriven and overdetermined how software is architected these days. So the needs of operators and incident commanders, but also the needs of other automated systems and how they think about the things that they're interacting with. The hexagonal architecture kind of the concept is an interesting place to, I think, start exploring that. I think it's a small echo, but I think it might be interesting for people to play with from an architecture point of view.
Next audience question. Oh, there we go.
It seems like when we talk about resilience engineering, we haven't really defined what's being engineered. It seems like, I'm new to the concepts here, but it seems like we're talking an awful lot about organizational behavior or human factors or learning. So I'm curious what any of you might say about what is it that's being engineered in resilience engineering?
That's good.
Yes.
So this is interesting because we've actually sort of had some coffee track discussions that touch on this. My perspective on it is that what we're engineering is the context in which people learn and understand. Because the terrain around us imposes constraints on what we can learn and how we can move and how we can change. We don't change as drastic cuts. We're not suddenly here and then I'm suddenly in Montreal. Change is continuous. We don't have radical breaks. When we think we have a radical break, what we actually have is an unperceived change going on somewhere else that suddenly imposes itself on our consciousness. So what we're really engineering is the context in which all of this can occur so that it can occur safely and more continuously and more consumably in our consciousness, in our ongoing presence.
I think I think everybody in the community should generally understand who Henrichs is, have read some of the Tavistock work on socio-technical systems, and understand. So if you listen to Paul first, you've got the technology, you've got at least groups of people, like teams. So that's socio and technical, and it is a joint activity system, right? It is a synthetic system of the technology and the socio system that is actually establishing that balance, right? It's like that's what they were studying. So just some really basic work there. Do some reading of Enid's work on socio-technical system design. I think that's super that I think is interesting and more difficult on a certain level. People, I think, will allow us to kind of talk about engineering social technical systems. They'll become more uncomfortable when I say we're going to engineer a social system. That sounds weird. But then there's this talk about individuals and individual resilience. Are we engineering individuals? I think, as a designer, I think we are designing our subjectivity. We are designing how we can be in the world. I use the word design because I think it sounds really strange to say we're designing individuals. But I think those are, so there's kind of psychological systems, some of the stuff you were talking about as far as language, there's joint activity systems, social systems, there's technical systems, and then there's the interrelationship between those three systems as synthetic systems that are all actually working together. So the answer is yes, because you can't separate them. They're entangled and they don't come apart, and if you try to take them apart, you will get brittle systems and not resilient systems.
I'm occasionally, so I think what you said is true, but I'm also going to express a feeling. I'm occasionally put off by the long reading lists, mostly because being in the master's program, I'm on the receiving end of it, right? So it just takes up too much time. But also, it comes across to me occasionally as gatekeeping. It's not abusive. I don't think anybody's distributing PDFs in anger, but it certainly can wear on personal development. So an alternative definition for resilience engineering, I would offer, and this is just my own personal view of it, is we can probably safely talk about engineering situations to develop the skills of adaptive capacity, right? And that doesn't necessarily require a lot of reading. I'm seeing some nodding, so hopefully maybe that resonates.
Well, I think much like Dr. Cook yesterday said, we've been doing resilience engineering for 3,500 years, right? Whether there are papers out there or not, it's people sharing information and coming up with better systems to improve ourselves and to improve our teams and to improve the complex systems that we deal with.
One way that we can think about the domain of resilience engineering, let's look at the REdeploy logo that's up here somewhere. So that's not the one I'm thinking of. The one I'm thinking of is a cycle, but it has people and then teams, and then what I'm assuming represents socio-technical systems, and then the socio-technical systems lead back into the people because the people inhabit it and have to act inside of the socio-technical systems. And that whole diagram is a simplification of what is the domain of resilience engineering. And you mentioned that Dr. Cook talked about how bone resilience engineering is 3,500 years old. We have a much older resilience engineering system, which is human society. And so actually, I think that the fundamental unit of adaptive capacity, to use Woods' term, is people, and that we should start there and build outward.
So, as a Woodsian, can offer a little bit of perspective on that as well. We often talk about the three aspects that are very similar to the logo: people, technology, and work. Work being the slightly different one there. So obviously, people are fundamental to sense making and understanding situations, gathering information, all these complex activities that make systems work. But the thing is, sense making in and of itself is not an isolated occurrence. You do it as, we call it a macro cognitive function. Micro being small. Micro is just you and a computer. Macro is beyond that. You plus systems, plus other tools, plus other people. And that creates the full workflow system that we're talking about here. These systems are large. Even at small companies where you have a lot of different users that you're touching. And so your system has grown, whether they're actual participants in the system, they're still problem holders, they're still stakeholders. So we're thinking resilience in a large sense, that You can have very small scale versions of it, small scale in terms of responses, but also the ramifications are large. And it all starts with understanding on that work site. You can help shape work and support the work that people do. And I think in and of itself, that is the core of resilience engineering. We're trying to engineer ways that people, as we said before, can do what they do, essentially.
Another audience question?
To your point about the gatekeeping, I totally agree, and I've been on the receiving end of read this, read that, and I've been on the giving end. And I've had the good fortune of working with an anthropologist at work who's working in a tech company. And it seems that there is a trade-off between, or a tension between finding common ground and gatekeeping. Because we've had some pretty tense conversations trying to find common ground because there's gaps in our understanding of her anthropological model, and then she has gaps in our technical model and cognitive models. And so this is such a multidisciplinary field where we've been talking about technical guiding and like just this whole range. So I don't know exactly what I'm asking, but how do y'all see the trade-off between gatekeeping and finding common ground when the area that we can be gaining wisdom from is so freaking large?
So I don't have an answer to that, but one of the things that I took away from yesterday from Dr. Cook is that this industry, the technology industry that we're in is relatively young, maybe in the scale of technologies, or in the grand scheme of academics is relatively new, even though there's old world concepts from that. The thing that I find that I took away from yesterday from Dr. Cook is how other academics are able to share and integrate with each other. How the scientific community specifically, on how they conceive and have a common language that can speak on and share that data. So it's one of those things where, again, I don't have the answer for, and I'd love for anyone else to maybe take a stab at it. But we can learn from these different, from different sciences and how they integrate or how they interact with each other, and there's something that we can adapt to.
So if we think about the presentation that I did, I'd like to suggest that it actually gives us a partial model for this. What we have is certain pieces of knowledge are already conventionalized. They're shared. We have overlapping expertise in some areas, other areas we don't have expertise. So with your anthropology example, you don't have overlapping expertise. You're functioning with two different sets of ground rules, of concepts, and we're trying to navigate that and build a shared expertise. If we want to move past gatekeeping, right? Gatekeeping function, to my mind, is in part driven by the need for expertise in the domain. It's hard to talk about things when you don't have the vocabulary for it, when you're taking very naive approaches that are known by people that study it to not work. So the more that we can build conventionalized versions of this that we can distribute, that can model on scientific communication disciplines, on linguistic communication disciplines, of how do we propagate this information to non-experts, that's a thing I think we need to build. This is one of the reasons I'm really interested in this upcoming website that Nora's working on, is because it has that reflex of how do we do outreach? How do we build the common ground consensus? How do we build conventionalized elements on which we can then further build, because they become part of our core way of reasoning about these problem spaces. And the more we can do that outreach, that weakens, that's a feedback that weakens the gatekeeping function.
Jessica Kerr gave a talk, keynote last year on semathecy, which is a concept that explores finding congruence in mental models, which I just think is a
beautiful idea to explore.
And you can see that talk on the website.
Christopher Alexander, who wrote the pattern language, who kind of founded the pattern language movement that dominated software engineering for a long time, or at least was used by a lot of software engineers for a long time. One of his patterns is called a mosaic of neighborhoods, and what he says is there's like 3 ways a city can be. It can be either homogenized, which is if you've ever been to Manhattan in the last 6 months or 2 years or whatever, and there's a Starbucks every 3 blocks that got that idea down pretty well. On the other hand, if you went to New York maybe in the 80s, you would have the opposite, which is what he calls ghettoized, and that if you were from one neighborhood, you weren't allowed to go to another neighborhood. You would be rejected in that other neighborhood. And then he says there's this other one that's this kind of a mosaic of subcultures. And what he means by this is that each of the subcultures is differentiated. It's that individuation that I was talking about. It allows you to say, like, this is Lily and this is Chinatown. They have distinct cultures and ways of being and senses. It's a locality that's specific to an emergent culture. But the boundaries are porous so that you can move through them and you can experience them. And one of the interesting things about this is that in order for this to happen, some people have to want to be kind of static parts or more stable parts of that community. They have to be the people who are local. And some people don't want that. Some people want to travel among those groups. And that travel and that experience is one of the ways that we kind of get these concrete rubbings that allow people to have delightful experiences and entertain themselves and feel better about the world. I think if we don't want to do gatekeeping, we need to avoid that ghettoizing, that rejecting of other people, saying, if you have an interest, you shouldn't be here. On the other hand, making statements about general ideas that the community shares and understanding the history of it, and not embracing the history of the labor of the people who came up with these ideas in the past, I think is part of how a culture actually occurs. There has to be a stable set of things, and that is not to disinvite, but to be other than in a way that activates the cognitive load that helps people think. So I'm an outsider in this community, and I had a great time. So you guys are doing a great time. But anyway.
I'd like to harken back to one of the other presentations. Why do we have gatekeeping? It's partially a survival mechanism, right? You're protecting your own. You're trying to not let anyone else ruin it or get their hands in it in a way that's going to disturb what is inherently yours. And so, thinking of from our systems perspective, some of the factors that have promoted that mentality, I mean, that's endemic to a lot of what we do anyway. We all have pride in our own work, so of course we don't want other people to take credit for it. At the same time, there's this duality that, you know, especially in the software community, that we have these unicorn companies, you know, this, I think Richard said it yesterday, that we have this mentality that, you know, each company is special, that they have their own way of doing things, and sure, we're sharing it out loud, and we do want other people to know about it, but there's definitely a lot of, you know, it's not the profession that's gaining it, it's the company that's gaining that notoriety. And yet we also have the whole mentality of open source, sharing code, sharing this wealth of knowledge that you're gaining through experience. So there's definitely pressure on both sides that, you know, we want more people to come in, but at the same time, there's some survival instinct that's also keeping it a little bit harder to get into it. There's no easy solution to that, but I think in some ways, finding more tractable avenues, because I know at least in academics, there's always pressure to write papers. And that is not the easiest or easiest to read, certainly, method to get the word out there. There's blog posts, there's videos, there's other types of media that can be very trackable to people, but sometimes the system is not incentivizing that. So I think we can change that.
You know, it's like, hey,
do you have a question or a comment? I have many comments, but I think those are some really great discussions that we're having about gatekeeping and stuff, and I think there's a lot that, you know, we covered kind of last night in the pub conversations, and like, it's an ongoing thing. I think it's a conversation we've had for a long time, but I wanted to switch gears, and Rein, I didn't see your talk this morning. I did follow the Twitch stream though, and it's something that I've had on my mind a while about the topic of blame. And one thing I've seen a lot is cultures that are like, yeah, we have the no blame culture. We're also fine naming each other. However, they do have a culture where someone's like, yeah, this was my fault, and everyone kind of just accepts that. How do you think about that when someone's kind of self-blaming and how that relates?
So I think that self-blame is different in some key ways from blaming other people, which means that the same set of trade-offs doesn't obtain for self-blame. Self-blame tends to be self-deprecation rather than a way to sanction someone else's behavior. It is even possibly an acknowledgement of your own transgressive behavior and an indication that you might wish to have done differently if the situation arises again. So in some sense, I think that self-blame can be healthy. It depends a lot on the context. It depends a lot on the way that people relate to each other in that circumstance and how that's perceived and how that's acted upon. Is that
very curious about so what I've seen before is, you know, if no one's kind of taking the blame for something, and we are naming like, okay, George, you know, submitted this PR, and Kara gave a LGTM, and then it went through, but she reviewed that in like 30 seconds, right? Because she trusts George a lot. But so then, like, that's a little bit different because we're kind of outlining the whole thing of what happened. But what if Kara came forward and was just like, yeah, this was completely my fault, like completely my fault. And I've seen multiple post-incident reviews where everyone in the room is just kind of like, okay, yeah, it's okay, Kara, you know, and they just kind of accept that and move on, and like that self-blame kind of takes a different stance than it would if we were blaming someone else, and we almost get into the trap of like not fully understanding that because someone's taking the rap for it.
Yeah, it seems like there's a fundamental difference in the nature of that statement, where if I say you're to blame, but if you say I'm to blame, it seems, especially in this context, where we are becoming more blame aware, and we may even use that pretense to refuse blame. Especially, one thing that might depend is the power relations of the people involved in this scenario. Are the people who are self-blaming higher or lower in some stratified system? Is it the managers that are doing that? Is it interns that are doing that? You know, who are the ones who feel comfortable self-blaming? How is it responded to in the moment? Do people say, no, it's not your fault? Do people say, okay, that makes sense? Do people sanction the person for self-blaming and say, hey, you shouldn't talk about yourself that way? I think it really depends a lot on the context, and that the same words can mean very different things in different contexts.
Isn't accepting fault the conclusion of a transaction and responsibility?
So, I think, yes, if I'm understanding that statement, I think the answer is yes. I think it depends on how we define blame and fault. That doesn't seem to be something that has been broadly agreed upon in these communities. It is entirely reasonable to blame someone in a way that is societally acceptable. It is entirely reasonable to then sanction someone in a way that is societally acceptable. There's even a reason to take responsibility for yourself preemptively, to say, no, it's my fault, I did it, so you don't have to blame me. That can, in a sense, diffuse the blaming judgments that you might be perceiving. So if I say, you know what, that's my fault, my bad, sorry, what other people will then perhaps do is not feel the need to blame you or sanction you in a heavier way, so it can be a form of self-defense. process that goes on in the mind where we decide on the moral valence of some act. Fault is sort of a conclusion. It's more of a factual conclusion in my mind.
There's like a development that says, the sovereign finds fault, and then the Kobar and says, okay, so we move from that to the society of discipline, which means what we're doing is we're taking the power of fault finding from the sovereign and giving it to the individual. But that means we have to teach the individual to be responsible for themselves and to self-discipline. Yes. And then the latest kind of move, if we want to follow this idea that the scientific rationality quantifies everything that it touches. The last move is the society of control, and the society of control is the idea that what you should do is never have to discipline yourself because you monitor yourself so well that you never make a mistake. And part of that is to have a sense that you're always being monitored by society and by yourself, and therefore you are constantly negotiating, avoiding discipline, avoiding the need to be disciplined. And in these kind of ways, the questions I think have to do with accepting or blaming oneself. If it is a way of questioning the knowledge that is power, you are making progress. You are moving somewhere. If you are accepting, disciplining, blame, accepting control as a way of reinforcing current power structures, this is probably problematic. Maybe that's
To the extent that it's my fault is sort of taking responsibility and ownership, I think there's a secondary message there which we might be attempting to convey, which is it's okay to make a mistake. It's okay to be the one who, quote unquote, caused the thing. One of these days it could be anyone else, and we don't need to shy away from such judgments if they are not destructive.
And I think on top of that, it relates to the talk from yesterday about having that, in the dice space, having that trusting environment that's around you, being a person that's submitting to, some transgression, or, that was my fault, is also welcoming that I'm trusting of the people that I'm around, that they'll accept that whatever that I've done is not in malice, but it's more of, this might be an area of opportunity of growth in the particular area, and I'm trusting you that I recognize that, and, let's move forward from that.
I want to make sure we're keeping track of time. Is there, I won't kind of cut anyone off, is there a couple final comments on this particular topic?
I just want to say that I think we're missing one little piece that Nora was pointing out. The point of that postmortem, of that gathering, is learning. And so when someone says that I have the definitive truth here, that it's my fault, we're cutting off that learning. That we know from these systems, there's multiple people there. I mean, any one person's model is incomplete. And so you can't take someone just on their word that maybe they were the trigger, but were they the entire scope of the problem? I don't think so.
Yeah, and I think there's this weird thing about, again, as an outsider, as someone who does too much management consulting training is good. This explanation that we're asking for, when we ask for like a postmortem explanation, has dual uses depending on who's consuming it. I think a lot of executives want closure. I think they want to know I don't have to pay attention to this anymore. That's what they want out of the report. Whereas I think I would describe what you were just saying as, we want to keep the causality weird for the team. We want to keep it open for the team. And so you've got this weird thing that you're trying to kind of modulate between two different audiences at the same time. I don't know, maybe you have to write two different versions of it, I don't do it. But I do think literally traditional causality, the answer is I want an explanation that closes the subject. That's what I want. And what we're suggesting is, no, we want one that enables us to grasp the subject, but keeps it open for further exploration. I think that duality is something that kind of bring.
Just as somebody new to the industry, one of the things that one of my internship teams did was a thing called a failure took the blame, you said this is my fault, but then you had a discussion about that fault, and the discussion normally led to, no, it was all Grace's fault. And I thought it was, so look up Billy about it.
I have a very selfish question to ask the panel, but before I do that, I'm gonna see, do we have one last audience question at all? I saw some hands go over there. I think I saw Mary's hand first. And if anyone else raised their hand, I'm sorry, I have to go to Mary because she helped with the conference last year. She's an integral part, she didn't help, she's an integral part of the conference last year. So I'm gonna ask my question, and then I'm gonna let her ask the last question that we tackled today. This is very selfish, but I'm very curious. So Marisa and Michael and Jabe all kind of talked about automation through different lenses. What is it like to design automation? What does that mean? How do we talk about it? And I would like to ask the panel, what do you think the 737 MAX case as it continues to unfold has for us to learn from it in the context of what you all discussed about automation? I said it was a selfish question, but I'm doing it for you. And it's for the whole panel too, but those are the talks I know where automation was a big aspect of it. We've talked about one or two, but let's maybe not.
Who was it? Was it Ryan who made, no, Will, I think that was one of your myths, that the most visible incidents don't necessarily teach us the most? I can't think of a good answer, so I'm trying to deflate the question.
Any thoughts before we go to?
I don't necessarily have a thought about automation, but the thing that I think is most interesting about the case in general is the idea of reconfiguration. Most of the claim was parts from other things that just got reconfigured, and that's part of the reason why it seemed like it should work. All these things have worked as subcomponents of other systems, we're just reconfiguring it. And I think to a certain extent, that kind of way of thinking about design, that way of thinking about reconfiguring things, is a way of, again, making things not strange enough to keep questioning. They seem like they should work. And I think, there's this idea that high-performance teams, they use those mental models a little differently than low-performance teams. They use the model, the plane, to notice when things are going a little wacky, as opposed to using it to stop thinking. And there's a subtle difference there, the way that they both use it to, both teams, high-performing teams, low-performing teams, use those mental models to lower their cognitive load so they can think about other things. But high-performing teams do that futuring thing that I talked about, where they predict what might happen and then notice when the prediction and the actualities don't match. And that, I think, is something that they didn't do as well as they could have. There should have been more examination of those just reconfigurations. That's the other thing I think I'm saying.
So the thing that's coming to mind for me on this is we talked a little bit about ideal cases versus typical cases versus nightmare cases. What we reason with when we are projecting to the future and trying to design things tends to be ideal cases. So as they're repurposing elements, as they're projecting into the future, they're reasoning from a position of how can we potentially make this work? How can this potentially succeed? And as a community, this tends to lead to brittle things that fail in unexpected ways when we hit the atypical cases that we haven't reasoned about. What I'd encourage people to do in your own work in order to avoid scenarios like the automation fighting with people and plowing your data center into the ground is to actively seek out what are these things that we are transferring? What are the assumptions that we're building into these things? What is the nightmare case? Do the exercise of the pre-mortem. Pose the question to yourself. Assume that in a year we have failed and that our company is now out of business because of this effort that we're putting in. Find a story. Find any story that tells you how you get from the decision you're currently considering to your company is now out of business. That helps you work through those counterfactuals because we don't think inherently in them. but they are critical to actually getting to an understanding of the effects of the nightmare cases.
And on that happy note,
Go ahead.
Yeah, so I'm a big fan of scenario planning, but I think this was the case where if you put a bunch of smart engineers in a room, they never would have come up with this scenario, right? So they couldn't think of the things that they could think of. I think it is a great example of Rasmussen's trade-offs though, right? They made an optimization for economic and workload, and they didn't understand how close they were to transgressing the border for safety. But how many hours did that class of airplane fly successfully? A lot, right?
I mean, you know, it's also like a weird version of cognitive engineering, because one of the things they didn't do is they didn't change the dashboard, because if they changed the dashboard, they would have to retrain the pilots. So it's not, it was, they were trying to hide the thing that they needed to notice at that moment.
Who was they though? I've got to believe that those were different teams.
Sure, I didn't say a team, I said they.
Well, but I mean, like, it implies that there's a consciousness that was capable of considering those multiple facets together at a single point.
Someone decided to take a indicator that a reasonable person could reasonably assume would provide information to someone and not show it to the pilot.
Reasonable person.
So there's local rationality there. For some people, that would be a very reasonable thing to want to include because that is a very key indicator. Other people might not appreciate the actual scope of why that was important.
Well, from a pilot perspective, anytime that something changes about the airplane that's significant, I'm sure Paul could probably back me up on this, is you have to get rated back onto that airplane. So it's an entirely new airplane, new process, set the FAA rules. I mean, it's kind of like how the medical industry right now, where they can't make too many different changes or advancements, or they have to go through the recertification process. I mean, that's just the possible explanation behind that. But
I also think it's like, there's a certain incoherency to say that we need to make systems more observable. But in a case where the system was intentionally was not made more observable, that isn't a problem. It seems like a problem.
Oh, I'm not saying it's not a problem. I'm saying you only know in hindsight where you should have made the system more observable.
But it's my understanding from reading and talking to people that that's not, it wasn't that they didn't, they made a decision not to retrain the pilots, and that decision is why they didn't make it.
okay, I got my fun, this was my selfish question. Did you have one last thought, Michael, before we have Mary's question?
So my reaction to about 4 different comments in there was, welcome to Dark Debt.
Ah, yes, and if you don't know, Dark Debt is in the Stellar Report, which is a PDF that you can read. Mary.
And a website too.
So I want to go back to Kate's talk for a second, and the thing that she mentioned at the very end, which I think is incredibly important, and I retweeted Erin who tweeted it, and then I tweeted it myself because I think it was that good. She said, when you are resilient, you can make your teams resilient, and you can make your complex socio-technical systems resilient. And I think, I mean, that's the whole point of this conference, right, is that we're talking about all 3 of those pieces. And I know that there's no silver bullet to fix all 3 of them at once, but I'd love to hear thoughts on, is there something that we can do that hits all 3 of those points that's kind of a, like, if we're doing this, it furthers the industry, or at least hits more than just one of those things.
Love and compassion.
Let's do this. Let's be a little transgressive. I think that actually there is a silver bullet here, and it's people. I think the silver bullet is that all of this works because people work. And if we understand the context that people have to live and work in, and the tasks they're trying to perform, the way they relate to each other, the way they're able to help each other, the way that people either work together well or not, everything else can be built on top of that foundation.
And there's been discussion about the whole organizational pressures, trying to get upper management to buy into it. I do think there is some value has to be both top down and bottom up there. People are going to be the ones who are going to be on the front lines, or they're going to be the ones that are really trying to implement some of these ideas in their day-to-day work. But then you also have to have advocates near the top to try and promote that from their position of power in that sense. If you want to see change all across the board, you do need help on both ends, because it's going to be just a resistance movement, guerrilla warfare on the bottom only, and it's going to be seen as unnecessary and unattached to reality if it's only from the top. So I think personally, it needs to be from both sides if we want to get full change. So there's no silver bullet, but a couple of different ways that we can approach it.
I think one of the pieces is we can't ask people to just make the changes that we're looking for. We need to look at it more systemically and think about why are people making the decisions that they're making, and make changes to the systems around them that enable them to naturally move in these types of directions that we're looking for, so that we enable this resilience.
My response is, if we go back to those complex systems are emergent from ecologies, by which I mean they're emergent from natural laws. They aren't emergent from any intentions. There are no intentions there. And we need to understand that the logics and the way of rationalizing about natural laws can explain those things. On the other hand, none of us live in nature in any remote form anymore. We all live in the ecology of artificial interactions. And what I mean by that is we are synthetic systems that have injected our intentionality into the world, and that world is reflecting back on us, and our logics, the way that we think rationally about the world, will not work anymore. They do not work correctly anymore, and that's part of the objection to trying to explain things using those logics. That means, I think, if we want to be more resilient, we need to come up with new ways of being rational, new rationalities, new ways of thinking about living in artificial synthetic systems that are not bound by natural laws anymore, and our personal responsibilities for that, and to what extent the capacity for human skillful coping can be exhausted at a planetary level and cause a significant collapse in that artificial ecology. So I think that if we want to have a real impact on the world, as resilience engineers, we need to learn to think as an ecology, not as an individual. We need to understand how we're extended into the world, and that we are not truly individuals. We are a mesh of things and people together. And until we can think that way, and talk that way, and sound not crazy, we will continue to have significant problems on this planet that we're trying to inhabit.
What I hear there is successful community.
Yes.
All right, I think that is a great note to end on. Let's give the panel a round of applause.